Hello fellow 3D enthusiast. Today we're going to be recreating this kitchen set and then blowing it up. Just for some background, recently I got to watch in on the filming of an advertisement and we needed to blow up a fridge. We actually used special effects rather than visual effects and ended up with everything we needed. But before we blew up the fridge, I was kind of thinking it might be a good idea to get some reference images of this set just in case the explosion goes off in the wrong way and we want to try getting something different. So I quickly snapped a few pictures with my phone, and here I am a few weeks later, and I'm doing it just for fun, because fun. So I started all this out in FSpy, which is a completely free program, and this program is really good for figuring out the rotation and focal length of your camera. Using FSpy is quite a bit faster than just trying to figure it out in Blender, so I would highly recommend using it. I'll make sure I drop a link for how to get started with that and the download links for it. If you're just getting started with camera projection, I made a kind of more comprehensive tutorial on it, which I will also drop a link to. Anywho, the basic idea of FSpy is you want to set the X and Y coordinates along some straight X and Y lines in your scene. You can see here I'm kind of matching up the points to do just that. And if you hold down Shift while you're dragging a point, it actually blows up the picture a little bit so you can see more precisely where you're putting it down. Once you're finished with that, you can save your FSpy file and then hop into Blender. Assuming you've installed the FSpy add-on, then you can just import that FSpy file right into Blender. That will add in a camera with the photo as the background in the camera, and that also adds in the correct resolution and focal length as well as the rotation of the camera. I like to kind of match up the XY and the ground plane with the ground plane in the photo, so that gives me a good base to work off of. And then it's all about just adding in a plane and starting to sort of form that to the walls and extrude that upwards and get the basic background of the set filled in. Once I've completed the ground and walls, I add in a cube and just start working on the cabinets. This tends to be a very imprecise process, so it can be kind of hard for people who like to get things perfectly, but do your best to push through it. Once we add the photo on top, that'll actually add quite a bit of realism back in, so it won't look too bad, even if there are imperfections in it. Alright, so I've pretty much recreated all the geometry that was in the original scene. I skipped out on the light up here, but that's not really part of what I'm trying to do here. So at this point, what I'm going to do is project the original image onto this geometry and get something that looks kind of like that picture. So I'm just going to create a new material for this. First of all, we're going to want an emission shader, and we also want an image texture and set that just to the FSpy file that you imported earlier. That is an image and it will work quite nicely. So now if we go to UV editing here, you can see I've already sort of done this before, but I just wanted to make sure and show you so you can see what's going on. Over in the 3D view, I'm hitting U and project from view, and that will do this. Now if we look at something like the material view, you can see it's actually looking fairly nice, and that's a pretty good passing resemblance. And the cool thing about set recreation like this is a passing resemblance will be just fine. Now I'm going to go ahead and do that same thing to these objects that I have here on the counter. If I hit Shift and then select the counter and Control L, I'm going to go Materials, and these aren't projected yet, so I'm going to hop back into the camera view, Edit Mode, Select All, U, and Project from View. You can see they hop right onto the places where they're supposed to be. Nice. Now I'm just going to go through and do that to all of these objects over here. Alright, so we have our digitally reconstructed set here. Now I'm just going to blow up this fridge a little bit, and I don't know if you saw it, but I reset the origin points of these doors here to be the hinge area, which is nice, because they can swing open and fly off now. Cool. So let's just get a basic smoke simulation going, and then I'll show you how I fine-tuned it to make it look a little bit better. Basic Smoke Simulation 101, you need a cube, and this is going to be our domain, and we're going to make it big, the size of the scene almost, so the smoke can go anywhere inside this cube. Now if we hop into the Physics tab here, and go Smoke, set this smoke type to be domain, then we have our domain. Now you need two parts for smoke simulation. You need a domain and something that emits the smoke. So inside the fridge here, I'm actually going to create something, not sure what. Let's try an icosphere and just kind of make that a little bit smaller so it fits inside the fridge and go around there. And now I'm just going to edit it so that particles emit from one side rather than the other. So I'm going to hit 1 to go into vertice select mode, select this vertice over here, Control and plus on the number pad. There we go. Control plus on the number pad grows the selection, so that's pretty nice. And actually I think that's a little too much, so Control minus to shrink it. Vertices, there we go. We've got an icosphere that's kind of pointing out of the fridge. Now for this boy, let's just add another smoke and then flow. If we go to the start frame here and then hit play, you can see our smoke is working. Nice. So this is kind of basic at the moment, and if you're going for basic, there you go. But I'm going to get this a little bit more interesting, and I'll be right back. Alright, so I've made a few changes, and I'm going to talk about them real quick and show you what they are before I forget what they are. So I've got a collection here called rendering. It's got some lights in it. If you look here, you can see these guys, and they are pretty much where I remember the lights were on the set. So that will match up with our set going on here. And as you can see, we've got some smoke going on. You can see that's taken off. And that's fairly nice. I still have some work to do on the fridge. Gotta animate that a little bit. But this is kinda getting close to what I'd like. So let's take a look real quick here at what's going on. There's an icosphere. I already told you about that. We've got that emitting smoke, except it's got a particle system going on. So here in the particle tab, you can see I enabled a particle system. Let me just run through the settings on this real quick. We've got about 500 particles going off, and it starts at frame 50, put a little marker here, and ends at 54, so it's a big burst, and then it's done. We've got a lifetime of 50, and I've turned up the lifetime randomness a little bit. So the source, I think this was unjittered, but I set that to random just so that it wasn't all coming out of the exact same faces and making kind of weird stuff going on. I didn't mess with the cache much. Velocity is set to 10, and I've also set the random to be up a little bit higher than 0, about a 0.49. For render, I set render as to be object, and here's the scale of that object, and it's just this little icosphere down here. That's got an emission material that I've put onto it. It's got a strength of about 14.6. Not super important, but it's bright, which is the main goal. Back to the icosphere, that's pretty much all the settings. You can see here is the icosphere object. And then I set up the smoke, which used to just be flow, but now I've set the flow source to be a particle system, and for that particle system, I set the particle system that I just created. I also set sampling subframes to about a 1, just so that there wasn't any jittering with lines, and you couldn't see as easily that it was kind of skipping frames. So that just makes these little dots look a little bit more well-spaced, kind of like it's one line rather than just a whole bunch of different frames. Here's an important thing. Since we added in the smoke before the particle system, it's a good idea to switch that in the modifier stack so that the particle system is on top. That way the smoke actually acknowledges that there is a particle system. So that's the particle system settings and the emitter settings. Another thing I did, if I just hop back real quick here, was I set this fridge to be a collision object and a smoke, and then just set the type to be collision, so the smoke will collide with the fridge, and that is a static object. I also set the scene to be collision, so that the particles would kind of bounce off it, and if you set the particles to bounce off it, you don't really have to worry much about the smoke bouncing off of it, because the smoke will actually follow the particles. It's kind of crazy and madness, which is what a real explosion is like, so I thought that looked alright. So I tested using cycles and stuff. That was costing me a lot of render time for not a very good result. So I went back to Eevee, and I've got something like this going on, which is unrendered with lights. And so now when I render an Eevee, it looks something like this, which I figure is kind of acceptable. I might work on the density and turn up the detail of the smoke a little bit. But for now, this is alright with me. Another edit that I made was to the material of just the general scene. If you look at shading, I've got our original emission shader, and I've also got a principled BSDF node, which are mixing together at pretty close to 50%, a little bit less, just so that we can have some lighting going on. And you see when we enable our lighting, that actually starts to kind of bounce off our In a second here, I'm going to work on doing some lights for the explosion just to get the scene reacting to that a little bit more. And I think that will really sell the realism. Alright, so right about now, this is what it looks like when it's rendered. Kind of liking the way it looks. Some changes I've made, let's see. I've added a explosion to the bottom door as well. And I've also added in a couple of point lights. These both have keyframes for the brightness. It just gets really bright suddenly and then sort of fades out. Right now, some problems I'm running into when I have the smoke going, you can actually see it kind of clipping through the wall here, which isn't good, but I guess I'll figure out a way to fix that with rendered layers or something. But I'm liking the way it looks. A lot of the lighting sort of solved the problem of the smoke just not looking very good. If we render it, you can see it looks something like this, a little bit like fireworks almost, which is perfectly fine with me. Once we get some camera motion blur, I think that'll end up looking quite a bit more realistic. Another thing I added was a turbulence force here that just sort of make things swirl around a little bit more, which I like the look of. If you enable the smoke, you can see before the particles kick in, there's this big gray mass, which is not exactly what we want. So what I'm going to do to fix that is go into the object settings, object properties, and look at, let's see, visibility, show in renders. This little checkbox we can animate so that when it goes like this, we can have it in renders. So I'm going to hit I over that. And then when it's like this, I'm going to check it again and hit I. And now when we render it, it won't be a giant big box in the way. So that's cool. And that's where I'm at just now. I think I'm going to take a little break and come back and work on it a little bit more. Alright, so I fixed a few problems here. One of them was that if you actually zoom in here, you can kind of see it still. The kind of explosion thing was clipping through the cabinets here. And I found out by turning the samples up to 200, it used to be 64, but you can see as I turn it down, you can start to see that right through the cabinet, which we really don't want because we want that to be solid there. So I fixed that by turning it up to 200, as I mentioned. You can see it's sort of fiddly, but back from the camera view, it looks fine. So that's cool. That's one fix. Another thing I just worked on was I added some textures to the inside of the fridge, which you can see here. If we take this to material preview, you can see I've actually got the, let's see, texture over here of after we exploded the fridge. And you can see it's pretty messed up, which is great looking for the inside of our fridge texture. Cool. One more thing that I have been experimenting with and I kind of like the look of is actually going, let's get the smoke back, in the render settings where I've got the volumetric settings as well. If you go down to color management, it's usually set to filmic, and I found setting it back to standard actually got an explosion that I like the look of more than with filmic. And I know there's probably reasons why I shouldn't do this, but I'm doing it because I like the look of it. So if we render here, you can see it's a really aggressive, fiery, clipped out explosion. A secondary reason maybe for doing this is to get the set to look as close to the reference images as possible, so that when you're cutting, there's not a whole bunch of values that are completely different from the original footage. So yeah, that's the changes that I've just made, and I'm going to keep working a little bit just to get some more debris and stuff flying out of here, make it look a little bit more crazy. So I just wanted to create some of this debris that's all over the floor here, so I created some basic objects and just projected this image onto them. You can see it's all fairly basic. I'm going to hit M now and add that to a new collection. And in my outliner here, I'm just going to grab that collection and put it in the collection of the set, just to sort of nest that up and get it fairly well organized. And now I'm going to go back to my layout tab. Don't need this anymore, and I don't need that anymore. So I'm going to use these two emitters that are in the smoke layer, and I'm actually going to use those to emit my other particle systems. So for now, I'm just going to hide the domain so that I don't have a whole bunch of smoke in my face while I'm trying to work on it. Then I'm going to go over to the particle tab here and add in a new particle system. So with this system, I'm going to, let's see, probably want render and render as collection. For the instance collection, we probably want the plastic layer of just the debris that we made. And so now when we hit play, it all starts coming out of here. That is absolutely insane. So we probably don't need 1,000 particles, so I'm going to drop that down to something like 100-ish. Actually, probably even less than that. I would say 30. And we'll just make these particles really big. So if we hop down to, let's see, get this out of here, get that out of here, render and scale. Just turn up the scale quite a bit. And we can use a little bit of scale randomness and set this to go off right when the explosion goes off. So up here at start and end frame, start on frame 50 and end on like 53 or something. So it all just comes out at once. Nice. So let's turn up the lifetime just so that it is always going to be around in the scene so we don't have it disappearing. Probably something like, I don't know, 200 will be safe. Okay, these pop out and they're just bouncing all over the place. We probably don't want that to happen, but I'm going to start by turning up the velocity because these are probably going to be flying out quite a bit faster than that. I would say maybe around 10 meters per second. Try that. Woo! Those are going all over the place. Cool. So I'd kind of like it if these just stuck to the ground after they hit it. I'm not sure that's going to work though, because actually this wall is part of that. So I'm going to go into edit mode real quick. Isolate this and just kind of grab these faces on the ground and separate those so that they're a different collision object. Just hitting P to separate the selected objects. And with this selected, I'm going to go into the physics. Let's look at our collision settings. Probably want dampening to be very high up there. So when they land on the floor, they just kind of stop moving. And I'm going to hop back out of my local view and let's see just what happens when we do this. That's not really working out so amazingly. Probably want friction as well, I'd say. Yeah, you can see these are stopping now. We can turn up the random value for that a little bit. They're just sort of bouncing around like rubber band balls. That's looking alright. So for this, we probably don't want it to be so ridiculously bouncy either. So I'm just going to be turning up the dampening a bit. Okay, that's working a little bit better for us here. And you can see our particles are not rendering as solid. That's all right. So let's talk about a problem you might be having at this point. I'm going to hide that, get that out of here. So if your debris is kind of going all over the ground, and say your dampening and your friction is pegged, and you're kind of wondering why is my stuff still moving, that's probably because your turbulence force is just kind of pushing it around, even after it hits the floor. So you can see it's kind of like, woo, getting jittery all over the place, like it drank some Red Bull or something. So a good fix for this, if you select your debris and head sort of to your particle system area, you can go down here into this craziness, and if you go to field weights, you can go here and you can see all these factors that can influence your particle system. At this point, if you look for turbulence and set that to 0, that should make it so that your stuff doesn't move around on the floor after it's hit the floor. What are we talking about? Okay, so I have set my particles to collide with the floor, and the floor has friction, and they were actually moving around a second ago, and that's just because I had the turbulence force still in there, but now their movement has pretty much died down. So if I go to somewhere like here and render it out, it looks fairly good. One thing that I'd like to work just a tiny little bit more on is sort of the resolution of the smoke simulation. You can see we've got some low resolution stuff going on here still, and it just doesn't look as high resolution as I would like. So something I'm going to kind of do a little hack on with that First of all, let's go to a place where our domain is in full sight towards the end here, and where our camera is as far out as it's going to get. And you can see we've got all this and all this down here, and that's all smoke resolution that's kind of going to waste, and I've baked it, but you just can't see it. So what I'm going to do to solve this is just scale it down on the z-axis. So I'm going to go into my camera view here, and as soon as you start scaling, you can see it just kind of disappears. So something I'm going to do to fix that is if you uncheck adaptive domain for a second, that way you can actually see what you're doing. So I'm going to scale this right to the floor because we definitely want smoke on the floor. And you can see we've got some free space up top still. So I'm going to hit 3 to go into face select mode, select this top face up here, and just take it down quite a bit. I'd say around here would be safe. So now we have a lot more of our resolution back, and when we bake it again, it should be a bit more high resolution. So I'm going to do that right now. Alright, so we're about done here. This is my final render. And this is the camera view from a bit farther away, just so you can get the big picture of what's going on. Right, so I hope you found this helpful. If you want to keep up to date on what I'm working on, and if you're interested in a complimentary free hydraulic kit bash elements pack, there's a link in the description that will sign you up for my email list, and I'll send this pack right over to you. Other than that, I'll catch you later. Cheers!